Alrighty, so we're going to talk a little bit about what the CBC does and sort of what the CBC contributed to building Canada as a nation. And the first part of that is a simple question of infrastructure. So we talked about this in our last video, that one of the challenges with managing radio infrastructure for Canada is that there are a lot of places that have a really low population density and have a population that's really small and really spread out. And from a private investment perspective, it doesn't make sense to build transmitters. But if you're a public broadcaster and you have a mandate to sort of attempt to unite Canadians, then you do sort of make investments in that. So in some ways, the CBC is the reason why there's radio and television service in many small and remote communities in this country, because as part of their mandate, they made investments in basically building transmission towers. So that's part of it. This is also the sort of space where the CBC started to develop a certain kind of talent and development pipeline in Canada, in that they started to build local news services and local news bureaus, so to train journalists and producers and sort of sound engineers and all of those sorts of things, and also to provide local news that sort of covered things that didn't make sense to put on the national news and certainly wouldn't have made international news. It takes a really long time before the CBC is making most of their own programming. They're still not making all of their own programming. There were rebroadcast pieces and whatnot produced in the US and in the UK as well, among other places, but that's part of it. But early on, most of their programming is like that, and now it's sort of flipped in that most of the programming the CBC offers is produced and developed in Canada for a variety of reasons in a variety of spaces. So there's that kind of like practical piece of what's going on there. But there are also a couple of things that are probably less well known about how the CBC functions and contributes in particular to the idea of nation building. And one of these sort of hits like an infrastructure question, and one of these hits kind of a political nationhood question. So one of the things that it's important to remember when you think about how, especially the prairies and sort of further north in a lot of places, how they actually got settled in this sort of Western sense, is that the Canadian government offered homesteads really inexpensively to new immigrants. So you could buy a homestead for $10, and we sort of talked about that process already. And that's great for you as a homesteader, in that it offers you this opportunity to buy land really inexpensively, and land sort of provides this kind of durable wealth, and that's really important. It's also important to remember that if you offer land like that, one of the things that is going to happen is that you're going to attract a bunch of people who aren't farmers, who don't have years and years and years of experience doing things like crop rotation and livestock management and worrying about food storage procedures and all of that kind of thing. There's a lot of knowledge and technique that goes into agricultural land management, and if you don't have that, it's going to be really challenging for you to eke out a living to be really successful on a homestead on the prairies, for example. So one of the things that the CBC did initially was to provide some of that kind of educational programming. So this meant that they would sort of make a decision, be like, all right, every Wednesday at 11 o'clock, we're going to be broadcasting a series on animal husbandry, on herd management for cattle, whatever it is. And they would produce on their end sort of 1 hour blocks of lectures and sort of programming designed to help people learn about these topics. And if you were interested in that sort of thing, you could write to the CBC, yes, with paper, you could write to the CBC and request, for example, a number of workbooks, and they would send you back however many workbooks you wanted for that program, and you could get together a group of 10 or 15 farmers, and everyone could listen to the same radio. This happened a lot in post offices and church basements, and sort of as a way of building community. But those workbooks would sort of allow you to be like, how do I apply these principles of animal husbandry to my own herds, and what do I need to change, and what is working well? to allow me to develop a more prosperous farm, and I'm going to do that in consultation with 15 other people in my community. And that kind of educational function is really, really, really valuable because in a lot of ways, that's a kind of education that you'd have a really hard time getting in these farming communities. In old farming communities, you would get it from your parents or from elders in the community, but when everyone in the community is new at farming and hasn't been doing this for generations, you have some serious challenges. So there's that education function, and this was sort of considered part of the CBC's mandate, in that that was a public service that was necessary to be provided because it also sort of offers you things like what is a good thing to use for insulation in my house when it gets so that when I plan this in the spring, I'll be able to stay warm in the winter, and all of those kinds of things that were really, really important to sort of people's survival as well as sort of their ability to establish more meaningful, sort of comfortable lives. So that's part of it. The second part of it kind of uses a relatively similar model of programming followed by booklets, but the purpose is a little bit different. The CBC, being a national broadcaster and being publicly funded, can also engage in a number of behaviors that aren't really viable for private broadcasters. So one of them is that the CBC is the forum for many of the initial national consultations on all kinds of things in this country, in the same sort of way, in that they would sort of say, hey, we're going to talk about this new program we're thinking about. So when we start talking about things like welfare programming, when we start talking about things like pension programming, when we start talking about things like universal health care, the way that we figured out that sort of what was really important to people in those processes is basically that they put together radio programs where where they would get 2 or 3 people to sit around and talk about this issue for 2 hours. And then instead of having these booklets that asked you to apply it, they would be booklets that basically said, what do you think about this aspect? What do you think about this aspect? What is your favorite aspect? What's your least favorite aspect? Similar to the kinds of course evaluations, for example, that you guys would grade at the end of a class. In that sort of way, and then you pick up all of those booklets and you mail them back to the CBC. And because the CBC is coordinating this across the entire country, you have a way, before the advent of things like the internet and even sort of reliable and rapid air travel, you have a way of getting a sense of where the whole country is at. And I understand that in the contemporary context, national consultation through radio is maybe a problem because there are some demographics who listen to radio and some demographics who don't. But if you go back historically, radio is the only means of communication that is available that way. So that is the most reliable way to reach everyone. So there's these sort of public consultation pieces, there's this educational programming, and that is sort of an important piece of understanding what the CBC is trying to do. In that, on the one hand, yes, there's this attempt to tell Canadian stories, to develop programming about Canada so that Canadians can get to know what other Canadians' lives are like, what it's like to live in Newfoundland, what it's like to live in the North. There's a number of sort of really well-known programs that are about that sort of thing. So if you've ever wondered, if you've ever heard sort of the Vinyl Cafe with Stuart McLean, you're like, why on earth is this here? And the answer is basically because it's just a series of stories about life in Canada, and Stuart McLean was an excellent storyteller. So there's that kind of question. But there is that sort of cultural piece, but there's also some really pragmatic functions that come out of the CBC sort of initially, in that they're like, hey, by the way, can you guys teach everyone how to make sure that their cattle herds don't get inbred? And the answer is yes, we can do that. We can figure this out. We've got some sort of stuff developed and that sort of stuff. So that's kind of an initial piece. We're going to talk a little bit in the follow-up about what the CBC does now, and sort of how we might look at this as a contemporary nation-building project in terms of what we're looking at there.